Dr. Sam here. Today we're going to talk about when it is not social anxiety. So first, we need to define what social anxiety is. The hallmark of social anxiety disorder is an intense fear of scrutiny, of being judged by other people. Now, all of us feel this to a certain extent, and I think it's easy to think, well, I have that, so I must have social anxiety. But in these cases, the intensity of that fear is so great that it's causing problems with going to work, going to school, going to social events. And the intensity is really, really high. This person feels a lot of anxiety, even in situations that other people wouldn't. And so we have ways of helping folks who have these issues, and it's a fairly common disorder, something we know a lot about treating. Now, as a clinician, if you're seeing a person who's having a lot of anxiety in social situations, it's easy to think, well, it must be social anxiety. But today I want to talk about another disorder for which that is also true, but is not social anxiety. Now, that particular disorder is emotional injury OCD. It's a subtype of OCD. And like social anxiety, there is a lot of distress around social interactions, but the core belief between the two is different. So in social anxiety, you would have the belief it would be terrible if people were to judge me, if people were to evaluate me negatively. In emotional injury OCD, the core belief is it would be terrible if I made somebody feel judged, and I would be responsible for that. I would be to blame. Oftentimes in OCD, we see beliefs around an inflated sense of responsibility and a very low tolerance for the possibility of doing harm to others. So in emotional injury OCD, that's exactly what we see. We see intrusive thoughts, obsessions of I'm going to hurt people's feelings and it's going to be all my fault and they're going to really, really be hurt in some significant way. And then compulsions, behaviors where they're trying to either prevent or repair that kind of harm. So I'm using excessive gratitude, or I obey anything anybody says, or I affirm, I agree, I find mental ways to agree, to affirm, to put other people at a higher level so I know that I'm not making them feel bad. I'm not hurting them emotionally in any shape or fashion. Now, those are similar. One is a fear of I'm going to be judged. The other one is a fear of other people are going to be judged. And so that similarity can mean that certain treatments for one are helpful for the other. In particular, if you put somebody in a social situation and you expose them to the possibility that there's going to be some bad social outcome, and they learn to tolerate that, that's good for both social anxiety and emotional injury OCD. And so from that perspective, there is some overlap. One treatment for one is good for the other. However, there are certain cases where you would want to take very different tactics depending on which of the two it is. So I'll give you an example. In social anxieties, we want people to have exposure to being judged, to being negatively evaluated, to being diminished, and to learn that they can move through that they can tolerate it and still be in the classroom, still be at work, still be in the event, and know that that anxiety isn't going to be completely overwhelming. Now, if you have someone with emotional injury OCD, the fact that they get diminished, let's say we set up treatment to expose them to being diminished, for many people with emotional injury OCD, that might actually come as a relief. Because when I'm diminished, if I have that particular subtype of OCD, then I know that probably whoever diminished me, whoever judged me, is feeling pretty good about themselves. So my diminishment actually relieves my fear because now I know that I haven't harmed them. I've left them feeling important. I've left their self-worth intact. And so, in fact, we do see compulsions of personal diminishment, self-deprecation, that if I were exposing somebody to that, I could actually be compounding their pathology rather than helping them as a clinician. Something really important to consider. Now, another important difference is just that in any kind of OCD, including emotional injury OCD, there needs to be compulsions, true compulsions, where a behavior is relieving anxiety in some meaningful way, and it's reached this point where it's sort of habitual. It's hard for the person to stop doing it. In social anxiety disorder, we do see something kind of similar. They're called safety behaviors. We'll see a person who, always sits in the back of the classroom, or wears clothes that don't bring attention to them. But it doesn't quite reach the level of a compulsion where we need to prevent that behavior, because that behavior is the thing maintaining the anxiety over time. And so one of the key differences is that emotional injury OCD does have compulsions, and they are sometimes hard to recognize because they're pretty pleasant. Things like agreeing, things like, being really thankful for things. But if you see those behaviors and that person seems to be doing them in a way that's excessive, that's limiting to their freedom to act and behave in other ways, then you're really looking at something more like OCD than social anxiety. Now, both OCD and social anxiety can have avoidance, but social anxiety avoidance looks a little bit different. I want to talk about that here and why that's an important distinction as well. Social anxiety avoidance is really the key feature of how the disorder is maintained. The more I avoid a situation, then the less fear I have, and that gets reinforced over time, and I learn to associate my social situation experiences with danger. In emotional injury OCD, if I'm avoiding social situations, I haven't really experienced much anxiety relief. Here's why. I might be offending people. I might be making them feel unimportant if I'm not joining them, if I'm not going to events, things like that, which is really the key fear here, that I'm going to hurt them some way. So you don't see the kind of social avoidance, even if the person does have a lot of anxiety when they're in the presence of others. They're also having anxiety not in the presence of others. They're afraid by not being with them, they're hurting them as well. Now, there is one exception. If somebody's in treatment for emotional injury OCD, sometimes the lowest level fears that we work on first are things like, not immediately answering a call or saying, oh, I can't make it tonight, something like that they'd be afraid to do, but it's a little more passive than in person directly saying something that might be offensive. And so at those low level, fears that a person has, obsessive fears, if they work through them, they might start to look more socially anxious, because now they're not afraid of ignoring people, but they are still afraid of confronting people. So it's really important in those cases to assess the historical presence of other affirming compulsions, gratitude compulsions, things that are indicative of emotional injury OCD. So I want to make one last point. I think I've kind of outlined the key differences here, but I want to talk about kind of another thread that I hear a lot about in popular culture, maybe popular psych, and that is this idea that when someone is kind of socially afraid, they're lacking confidence, that the goal is then to help them be more dominant, to be more confident, to be maybe even a little bit, more using of other people to kind of assert their will on others. And I think you hear stuff about like people being more alpha or something along these lines. You may be familiar with this kind of subculture. I want to point out why I think that draws people in, and also where people get it wrong. And that is, it draws people in because as a person who is, say, socially anxious, if you're exposing yourself to situations where you have to confront people, or say a person with emotional injury OCD, this is actually true for both. If you're exposing yourself to situations where you have to confront people, you will get better because you're dealing with these fears, either fear of being judged or fear of hurting others' feelings. However, that good feeling that comes from those exposures over time, I think it gets conflated with this being a jerk thing that really doesn't have much therapeutic benefit. So people think, well, that's the thing that made me feel better. I think that's a mistake. The real thing that made you feel better was just learning that you could confront people and that life went on. And so that didn't become as anxiety provoking. Just a little thought for anyone who's kind of explored those threads over time, for what's really going on, what the active therapeutic ingredient is there. So I hope this was helpful. I'll put a link below to the paper I wrote, kind of outlining the theory of emotional injury OCD. If you have any questions, I hope you'll reach out. Engage with the channel, subscribe, click on the notification button so I can send more information out to help educate and connect people who are interested in these topics. Stay in touch for more opportunities in the future, and until next time.